Linux Luddites, episode 66, the 13th of December, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we trial the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Paddy. And today we're bringing you all the news from around the free and open source world, then settling down over a pint and wondering what the future holds for Mozilla. And I guess, depending on where you look, Mozilla's ongoing troubles have been variously attributed to incompetent management, hubris, inane political correctness, and just plain old greed. We'll chew around the topic a little while and see if we can't come up with any conclusions. And I guess it's also interesting, considering the market share of the products, to think on why we're talking about Mozilla at all. I mean, is this an organisation with any real relevance today? Or are those of us wringing our hands simply harking back to half-remembered glories from years ago? Anyway, that conversation's coming up later. But for now, let's move on to the news and talk about one of the current leaders in the open source world.
Yes, first up in the news, the great open source leader, Microsoft. What? Yes, it looks like we'll be talking about Microsoft for a couple of stories here. The first one is that Debian GNU/Linux is available on the Azure cloud now, joining the likes of Ubuntu. So that is interesting insofar as it's the only distro available that is community maintained rather than backed by a company like Red Hat or SUSE or Canonical.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting because there clearly must be a demand there for it. And we spend a fair bit of time on this show talking about the supporter engines for Debian and how some of us may like it, but quite often on servers we tend to go for Ubuntu, say, instead of straight Debian, simply from a support perspective. But clearly the demand must be there for Microsoft to bother doing this.
Yeah, I know we've had previous news articles about how Debian's share, maybe 4 or 5 years ago was a fairly large chunk of the Linux installs, and that's been eroded away, mostly, I think, in favour of Ubuntu, but also, as you said, SUSE. And there's clearly something that they're still doing, or a core or a group that still find Debian relevant. And so this is one of, is it 8 or so distributions you can get on the Azure cloud?
Yeah, Ubuntu, RHEL, CoreOS, Oracle Linux, CentOS, SUSE Linux Enterprise, and OpenSUSE. So that is a fair number now, but Debian does stand alone there. And Debian's whole thing is freedom, isn't it? And that it's all free software, and it's almost kind of FSF approved. So it seems a bit weird that people who are wanting to run it on a Microsoft cloud would be interested in Debian, because surely the people who are interested in Debian are the freedom people.
Well, what would the freedom people run Debian on if it wasn't Microsoft? It would be Amazon, if you could have it on there, but that's not exactly a good choice from that freedom point of view. I suppose you'd have a droplet. That's not really going to scale to the size of servers and things that you would want for these sorts of implementations. So I don't think that you're really going to have a way of hosting on a large, I'm going to say corporate, because they generally are, sort of infrastructure, because they're corporate and therefore they're unlikely to be really sort of plug in the freedom aspect, as you're saying, these people who would want to run a Debian GNU/Linux distribution would want. So I don't think there's really much of an option from the freedom point of view.
And of course, all of this gets stamp of approval from our freedom-loving friends at the Linux Foundation, doesn't it?
Yeah, now Microsoft is offering a Linux certification with its Azure cloud, but you do also have to pass the Linux Foundation sysadmin exam. So it really feels like Microsoft and the Linux Foundation getting in bed together, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's some sort of partnership, as you say, to show that you've got both the ability to run the Microsoft side of things and the Azure cloud platform, and on top of that, be able to implement Linux successfully on top of it. Because I guess there's no point in you being the world's greatest sort of Azure maintainer if you can't then allow the software which the stack that people see on top of it, you can't administer that and run that well. And it would look bad from both points of view, both from Microsoft's point of view and from the Linux Foundation's point of view. So as you say, you've got to do these two separate courses, which I don't know if it then doubles the cost, because you could just work out how to do the Azure part and become that way skilled, and then have to pay again to do the Linux Foundation part. But clearly you need both of them if you're going to be able to implement this and neither party come off looking bad. And if that means they get in bed together, then there's the partnership, isn't it?
Yeah, I think as Jesse's saying, I mean, Jim Zemlin has come out and suggested that in the realistic world, both platforms are equally viable, Linux and Windows, and are used. And if you want to be a good sysadmin, you need to look after both, because they two are often found conjoined.
Can you imagine 4 or 5 years ago talking about something like this? It just seems, or at the time seemed unthinkable. Maybe a little bit longer ago, but still, there was a time when Linux was, described as a cancer by Boomer and stuff. And it just seems weird to me that we've got to this stage where Linux has become so widely used that even Microsoft are having to accept that.
Yeah, and the converse, of course, holds true. I mean, can you imagine a time when the main organisation purportedly forwarding the interests of Linux would be happily opening its arms and other parts of its anatomy for Microsoft? Actually, I take that back. I can imagine a time, because the Linux Foundation haven't been community orientated, I think is probably the polite way of putting it, for a long, long time. I mean, they are a trade body for the companies that form them and fund them. And it's just a realisation, I think, of how the world actually works. But Jim Zemlin certainly seems to have sped up the move in that direction since he's been in situ there over the last couple of years.
It ties in with the criticism that Linus has been getting about his conduct, and how we said that doesn't really feel very corporate, and how there are certainly people within the Linux Foundation that would probably like to see the back of him and try and tidy up the whole image and make it all sterile and corporate. It seems that we are moving towards, or maybe we have moved into, a period sort of beyond where Linux was put together by hackers, and now it's really is serious business, literally.
I notice you use the emotive word sterile and corporate there. And I suppose there is that view that it's that way, but at the size it is now and the deployments that it has and the uses that it has, you do need some sort of, maybe sterile is not the right word, but sort of crisply organised kind of way of making sure that there is this backing behind it, which big corporations can see eye to eye with, rather than the sort of hacker culture that is very difficult to really to see. And it always comes back to this dichotomy where the people who enjoy Linux want it to stay kind of in people's pockets and with hackers and things, but then Linux itself is so big and runs so many massive server farms and things like this that you do need the big foundation or corporation to maintain that. And you kind of, I think we're trying to have both, and people see that one side, they want the little hacker at their house and like us using Linux just because it's there and it's fun and you can tinker around. But you have to then separate that, I think, from the massive deployment that it has, and just leave, the Linux Foundation to do its thing and make sure that Intel and Cisco and all the people who want it from a corporate point of view get the sort of the responses and the inputs to it that they want. And I think they're two very different things. The fact they have to live side by side or intertwined makes it difficult, but I see it as two, as I say, two different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I think it's certainly accelerating as well. I mean, thinking back over just the duration of this show since we've been putting it out, the news has changed. I mean, we used to report on the goings on at Google and various other companies sort of spasmodically, but there were always desktop Linux things or server Linux things to report on. And now, sadly, the news is dominated by things like what Google are up to. And there just is very little else going on around the place. And the tinkering side of things just seems to be sort of disappearing a little bit.
I don't think that's entirely true. I mean, look at things like Solus, what Ike's up to. I mean, that doesn't have some corporate agenda. That's just someone, a small group of people trying to make a great OS using free and open source software.
Yeah, there are always going to be the examples you can pull out, and Solus is exactly one of those. And we look forward to reviewing that when that eventually becomes its full release. But moving it on, the Let's Encrypt certifications have now moved into public beta as of the 3rd of December. So there's a bunch of big sponsors behind the Let's Encrypt initiative, including Mozilla, the EFF, Cisco, Facebook, and some other ones, which the list goes on. And it was in a private beta for a number of months, during which time 25,000 certificates were released, and this has now moved into the public realm. So you can download the source client from GitHub and produce your own certificate, which is recognized on the main browsers. So Chrome, Firefox, IE, or Edge is the new one, isn't it? So there's also reports that it's quicker and easier to do because they've automated a lot of it within this script. You need to put your email in and obviously set up a few of the various parameters. But rather than having to manually do a lot of the process, they've tried to make it slicker.
Yeah, they've made it incredibly easy. All you do is download a script to your server, run it as root, trust that it's going to do it all fine for you, and Bob's your uncle.
Do I hear some sarcasm in that?
Well, it's not that I don't trust it, but as a fledgling sysadmin, I suppose you might say, I've got a server that I run various podcasts off, which I won't plug here, but I think everyone knows what they are. And so this is aimed at me, isn't it? It's aimed at people who don't really know enough to set up SSL certs the proper way, but know enough to, run a simple script and put my pseudo password in and let it do its thing. But I haven't done it. And the question is, why haven't I done it? It's not because I'm lazy. It's because it just doesn't quite feel right to me. How can I put it?
You don't value your users' privacy?
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah. Yeah.
I've got to pick you up on your use of the phrase "the proper way" in that little bit of speech there, Joe. I mean, the proper way you're implying is to go along to a certificate authority, give them lots of money for no work whatsoever, and open yourself up to all sorts of possible security risks when they work hand in glove with the authorities as well. I mean, that is the proper way until services like Let's Encrypt appeared on the scene.
All right, well, let me ask you this, Paddy. Are you going to be using Let's Encrypt on our server?
We've just renewed about a month ago for another 12 months. Quite possibly at the end of the year, yes. But things will have settled down in a year's time and we'll be in the best position to judge how it's working. I mean, it has proved enormously popular. As Jesse said, there were 25,000 certificates issued in the private beta. And as far as I can tell, there's been over 75,000 issued since that in the last week or so. There are problems as well, which you kind of picked up on from a security point of view, that you're trusting this script that runs as root. And it's running frequently because by default the certificates have got a 3-month expiration. But there are alternatives out there, and one of the links I'm going to stick in the show notes is to a Hacker News thread. And I started collecting alternatives from that and putting them in the show notes, but I gave up in the end because there are quite a lot of them. It's one of the joys of having an open API, which is what Let's Encrypt has. It means people can come along and write their own scripts that do the same thing, some of which don't require root, some of which are actually web-based. And it comes back to the conversation we've had previously about whether open software or open APIs are more important or similarly important. And I've always come down the side that open APIs and actually be able to get at data and manipulate data is more important than having free software per se, because you can always write software. It's getting access to the data. And that's what a lot of these other applications can do because of the way they've set Let's Encrypt up. And I've got to give them top marks for that.
This is very strange, Paddy. I remember every time Let's Encrypt's come up before, you've been very negative about it.
It's difficult because I am deeply suspicious of the whole HTTPS thing. I, A, don't see a need for it in most cases, and B, have never trusted certificate authorities. And that has been a large part of the conversations we've had over time is shadiness and the money for old ropeness, if you like, of certificate authorities. I mean, I think I've probably said on multiple occasions, it really is a bit of a scam. And it is a bit of a scam, the way it has been done previously. This is offering a free solution, which is one part of the equation you're looking at, is actually getting it for free, because it is largely a no-effort endeavour on their part. So why on earth you should be paying for it in the first place? That's one question. Trust is the other issue, and I want to come back to that when we talk about Mozilla later on in the show, so I won't let that one out for now.
So is this basically going to make all existing certificate authorities null and void? They're going to have to change their business model or just close the doors and walk away? Because why would anyone go to an existing one? You know, I mean, the example you gave of our server, we've just renewed, but when we come to renew again, likely to move over to the Let's Encrypt. So there's no real reason to have any other certificate authorities.
No, I disagree with you. I mean, we use Start SSL, which is another free service, and there are a couple of different tiers effectively within certificate authority business. And the likes of Start SSL and Let's Encrypt are quite happy to issue certificates based on email addresses as proof of ownership of the domain and what have you. The more expensive services theoretically check you against things like you actually physically exist in the real world, that you've actually a functioning business that has property on XYZ street. And I don't think that market is going to disappear because of this. I think it's the folks like Start SSL that are going to have big problems. Well, Start SSL in particular, because it's such a lousy service with an atrocious front end.
Okay, fair enough. Well, let's get our fledgling sysadmin to update us on where PHP is these days.
Well, PHP 5 has been used for a very long time, that branch, and there were attempts to update it to 6, which didn't really work out for various reasons. And so 6 was skipped, and now PHP 7 has been released. So I read through what makes PHP 7 faster and better than 5, and I'm afraid it was mostly Moonspeak to me, but it looks like it's faster and better in every way. That's all I could conclude from it, I'm afraid.
No, that's just not good enough. Not good enough at all, young man. Come on, tell us about the null coalescing operator and the spaceship operator.
Yeah.
It's the pop ping push pull thing.
Right, go on, Paddy. You actually know about this stuff. What does it mean?
I do, but it's not that interesting, to be honest.
Is my summary fair then? It's just better and faster.
It's better and faster. And in tests I've seen, it's still not always as fast as Facebook's implementation of PHP, which has got to make the devs a little bit on the sad side, I should think. But they do seem to be adding syntactic sugar. I mean, the null coalescing operator is syntactic sugar, basically. It's nothing that you can't do with some if then else's or a nested ternary operator. And the spaceship thing is sort of old hat in quite a lot of other languages. I mean, it's good for sorting and stuff like that, but it seems to be an incremental release, really, with a huge rewrite of the back end to actually get some speed.
Right, well, as I said, I'm going to have to take your word for all of that Moonspeak that you just said there. But PHP is very widely used, isn't it? We think these days about Node and stuff like that and JavaScript being king, but the reality is that PHP still does run a very big chunk of the web, doesn't it?
Yes, most of the web. I mean, you think about things like WordPress and Joomla and Drupal. And we've spoken about the prevalence of content management systems like WordPress fairly recently, I think, and they really do form the backbone of the internet we see today.
Well, that's a good thing, because PHP is incredibly secure. And oh no, hang on a minute. So let's move over to Veracode, who have released their State of Software Security report. And to do this, they scanned 50,000 applications over 18 months and looked at 11 different languages that all these applications are written in. And of the applications they looked at, the Java ones, only a quarter of them were vulnerable to the SQL injections that they tried, whereas PHP was vulnerable to 3/4 of those same SQL injections. So it looks like the way that Java's been implemented is naturally more secure, or the way that it's able to be written allows the programmers to get it in such a way that it has sort of fundamental security as opposed to PHP. And the Open Web Application Security Project has sort of a top 10 of the quality coding benchmarks that you can run. And this then is a second test that they've done and released the results for. And of these top 10 quality code tests, 80% of the PHP applications that were tested failed, but then 70% of the Java ones failed as well. So it's not exactly like Java's coming out well on top. And the one that passed the most, or had the fewest failures, was C and C++, with 40% of those applications failing.
Well, isn't that because to write things in C, you have to actually know what you're doing, whereas any Tom, Dick and Harry can chuck stuff together in PHP? Or am I grossly stereotyping there?
I think you're accurately stereotyping there. I mean, that's got to be one major factor in this, hasn't it? That people whacking up websites and applications online, the cut and paste culture, if you like, where you find a bit of code that actually does what you want. You're not really sure how it works, but it works, so you just whack it in. That really does have to contribute here. And things like Java have got a bigger learning curve, full stop. So even if you're not just cutting and pasting, you do need to have a little bit more skill to write in a language like that. I thought the actual report was interesting, though, because although Vericode have obviously got a dog in the hunt because they basically provide testing services for people, the report itself covered a whole bunch of ground in a fairly easy-to-read manner. And one of the things that caught my eye was the Android stats. I don't know if either of you two looked at those.
I noticed they were similar to iOS, but was there a particular what's the particular information you're looking at?
Well, it's just where they were seeing a lot of the failings, and the sort of top 4 items they found for cryptographic failures were insufficient entropy, improper validation certificates, clear text storing of sensitive information, and use of broken or risky cryptographic algorithms. And they were by far and away the biggest contributors to cryptographic issues on Android. And you would think that really that comes down to 2 issues. I mean, there's the programming side of things and the competence of the programmer for most of those, and then there's the entropy side. And we can obviously train people or try to improve the skills of programmers so they're not using broken algorithms or re-implementing things they actually don't understand what they're doing with. But I was really sort of intrigued by the entropy side of this.
So are these implemented in the same way as you would do when you produce paired keys on a Linux machine? So I always picture that funny little box that you have to whirl your mouse in to create entropy and all these sorts of things. The longer your PC's been running, the greater the entropy. And so is that the same on the Android phone, that it's the entropy within the phone, or is it sort of done on the server and then it's downloaded to your phone and it's the entropy and the cryptographic signings are done elsewhere, and so you have no influence on it?
Yeah, my understanding here is we're talking about entropy from the phone, and it's just whether that is going to be an ongoing problem with this sort of device. I've just not seen much research on this, and I'd be interested if anyone listening has got any further information about it. Just drop us a line to show@linuxluddites.com, please.
That reminds me of the entropy problem with the Raspberry Pi in Raspbian specifically, where because it boots straight to the desktop, it doesn't have time to gather enough entropy during the installation process and stuff like you would with a normal Linux distribution. So it does seem to tie in with the problem of small embedded ARM devices.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not really seeing anyone address, as I mentioned, so further information would be most welcome. Anyway, let's move on to Google. And last news show, we spoke about the new app streaming capabilities, and I can remember we had a long chat around that.
Yeah, I remember being a bit baffled by it, or at least pretending to be.
Yeah, well, hopefully now you can see one of the main uses for it.
Yeah, they've decided that if you want to demo your application or game, whatever it may be, they can actually stream it within the advert. So when you get the pop-up that says, why don't you try Angry Birds 55 or whatever the beach raiding one is, you can start playing the game within the advert because they're streaming the game to your phone. And then if you decide to install it, the whole process of payments and things like that goes on and Google takes their cut. But if you've tried something before you buy it, I think you're more likely to then move on to buy it because you know if you like it or not. But if you just see an advert, I think all of us would say, well, the graphics don't look like the kind of thing I like, or it's not an RPG or a strategy or whatever the game may be or whatever the advert may be for. And this way, at least you get a sort of 30 seconds worth of play, and it's a far more involved advertising method. And so people are more likely to buy it and more likely to use it, and, you know, the advertiser wins and Google wins because they get paid as well.
And the reasoning behind this is, well, let me just quote from the article. Google reports that a high number of people who download apps never even open them. Now, this reminds me of every Google I.O. They come out and say things like 3,200 billion selfies have been taken. And the question is, how do Google know this? How do they know that you never open an app? Well, the answer is fairly obvious, because they have got enough proprietary stuff going on in Android to report back home and tell them that. But the fact that people don't seem to care about that is a little bit worrying to me.
Well, I guess it just comes as part of the territory when you put your computing capabilities in someone else's hands. But I mean, it does make sense from Google's point of view they're doing this, because it'll obviously provide a much more frictionless way to be selling apps and getting adverts in front of people that are interesting, and that's been a big problem for the advertisers. But anyway, let's talk about some directly Linux-related Google news.
Yeah, bad news for people who don't have up-to-date hardware and want to run Chrome, because in March next year, which is only a few months away, Google are going to retire Chrome support for 32-bit Linux, which is quite a big thing, and also the older versions of Ubuntu and Debian. So you're pretty much stuck using the latest version of Ubuntu, or at least the latest LTS, in 64-bit version. Otherwise, you're going to have no Chrome and therefore no Flash, or at least not the latest Flash, which I think is not a huge issue for most people. But this is very strange to me. I mean, I can see why they want to do it. They want to cut their development costs. But I thought the whole point of Chrome was to make it ubiquitous. And this is just going to mean that there are fewer people using it, surely. And that's just goes against everything Google's about.
So is this actually affecting the Chromium base as well? So we won't even be in a position where we can go and compile it ourselves?
I don't think so. I think Chromium is still going to be available, but it's just the proprietary Chrome one that is going to be abandoned.
So what are you going to do, Paddy?
Fortunately, I moved to 64-bit a while back.
But aren't you on 1204?
I'm on 1404.
Ah, right, so you're fine then.
Yeah, and I made that move largely out of whimsy. I mean, there was no pressing need for me to do so. But the point is that a lot of people out there, a surprising amount of people out there, I think you'll find, still running machines that aren't capable of 64-bit code.
Well, certainly all the netbooks that had 32-bit atoms. Beyond that, I doubt there are many machines still running that don't have 64-bit capable processors, surely.
We are going to get a myriad of mail with all these people with old laptops. I mean, you and I both have laptops that are 32-bit. Okay, they're not our main machines, but we certainly have them knocking around, and you don't have to go that far back to have a 32-bit machine. I mean, you can still run Firefox and Midori, and you know there are alternatives. And like you said, they're still going to be releasing Chromium, so you can use that version of it. But I don't run Firefox or Chromium. I've settled on Chrome as the one that incorporates the things I want to use and the speed and things like that. And so if I was on 32-bit, this would be a bit of a blow, I have to say.
Now, you say that I've got 32-bit machines knocking around still. I don't think I have. I've got my ancient ThinkPad, which isn't even capable of running Ubuntu or anything. But apart from that, I think everything I've got is 64-bit capable now. Gave them all to you two, I think.
It's nice to know who your friends are.
So while Google are ramping down the deployments of Chrome on the desktop, they have massively ramped up their use of Chromebooks within schools in the education within America. So in 2012, they had less than 1% of the market share of educational devices in schools. And 2015, or the third quarter of 2015, they had over 50%. So that is an almighty increase. Apple in the same sort of period went from 52 down to 24, and Microsoft from 43 down to 24. So there's a, they've clearly taken a huge chunk out of the Apple and Microsoft share. It doesn't include desktops, so it's only for Chromebooks and sort of mobile devices. And it does cover all school between kindergarten and the age of sort of 17 to 19. So that's sort of college or sixth form in the UK, which is basically, as far as I can see, the entire learning career of all the children. So college, sixth form, you don't even have to go to. So that's basically since you start school until you're finished with your compulsory education. And if 50% of the devices are Chromebooks, it's incredibly likely that your school will have them. But they're not done quite so well outside of the US. The figures are way, way lower. But just focusing on the US there, this is basically a way of getting Google into the brains of the children, as far as I can see. This is a really good way of getting people Googleified at a young age.
Oh, you cynic. It's a public service.
Yeah, it's the year of Linux on the desktop, finally, even if it is, a proprietary UI on top of the Linux kernel. I don't know, would you rather your tax money was spent on iPads or Chromebooks?
Oh yeah, Chromebooks, absolutely. The value is so much better. It's sort of £200, £250 for a sensible Chromebook, but it's going to be $350 for an equivalent sort of Microsoft-based standard laptop, and who knows how much for an iPad.
Yeah, it's the admin costs, really, isn't it? That's the killer here. I mean, Chrome is so easy to look after, and you move between desktops quite happily, and if you have any problems, it is the admin aspect, I think.
I wonder whether or not there's actually too much tech in the schools, and the reason for this point is that in the article that's linked in the show notes, there's a picture of some kids at school, and they're sort of doing some maths on a Chromebook, and it's got equations and bits and bobs. I just sort of wonder, well, how quick is it to write out an equation in a Chromebook versus just write it on a piece of paper and doing it on paper? I know I'm from an old school kind of realm of schools. My schools had blackboards, so the idea of smart boards and all clever stuff is beyond. It came in just after I finished, basically. Our modern technology was an overhead projector where people could write on it and scroll the transparency and stuff. It was ridiculous. And now we're seeing what schools have with smart boards and being able to write on them and projecting things and having YouTube and things. It all makes a lot of sense. But there is the worry that you have an overly sort of techie kind of way of doing things without actually thinking that you can learn this as easily with pencil and paper.
Are you trying to say that the companies who sell this technology have stitched up these schools and just sold them loads of unnecessary stuff and spent yet more taxpayers' money on things they don't need?
That may well have happened. But then I suppose if you've bought one, and like Paddy says, you've already bought the education software that comes, the applications which are specific for education, and you've already paid the fees to have all of the updates and keep it up to date and running and things, you may as well use them wherever you find use for them. I just wonder whether or not people are forcing it into situations where they're not so useful. I mean, obviously, if you're writing something up and you need to hand it in, you might as well write it straight on a PC, because you're going to be doing it on a PC anyway. Why'd you write on paper at school first just to go home to write it up? There are very good use cases. I just wonder whether they're going to be useful in all lessons.
Well, the argument is that kids need digital skills because all workplaces use digital technology. And so they need to get their hands on computers from day one in school. And I suppose it's a potentially positive thing that if they're learning to use Chromebooks and rely on Google cloud services, maybe once they get into the workplace, they won't be using Microsoft stuff. But then I suppose that's just replacing one evil with another.
Yeah, what you don't really want, and which is the complaint that I think certainly in the UK they've had against Microsoft and the Office suite, is that you don't want children to only know how to use Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel. You want children to know how to use a word processor, or there is a function for bullet points, there is a function for tables. You need to know how to look for that function, not that is the bullet point icon and that is the table icon. So actually what you should have in some sort of ideal world is a quarter Chromebooks, a quarter Microsoft Windows, a quarter Apple, and a quarter Linux, so that you get a range of different devices and different interfaces, so that you're not learning how to use one particular piece of software. You're learning what software can aid you in producing reports and things like this.
Nah, what you need is Triskel on all their machines.
I think there's a much broader conversation to be had here, which we won't do now, about the place for technology in education, as you suggest, though, Jesse, and whether it is a good thing or whether it is just a money-making wheeze for everybody involved.
Well, talking about money making, some of the other numbers which I've got noted down is they reckon there's about 9 million devices in the US, of which roughly 50% are currently Chromebooks. And they say that the school districts are going to increase by 11 million next year. And that is a vast increase from 9 to 11 on top of that. That's more than double. And if Google manages to remain at the 50% or increase even more, that is a huge windfall for Google and the developers and manufacturers of Chromebooks.
Yep, that it will be. But not everybody's really happy about all the Googliness in schools at the moment. And the EFF have laid a complaint against Google, saying they're breaking their privacy pledges they've previously made about what they do with student data. Now, what's being alleged is that Google obviously are collecting browsing history, YouTube videos watched, all the sort of visual information they do collect from all of us. And I found the reporting around this really interesting, more interesting, in fact, than the actual bare story, because on one hand, you've got the EFF saying they're collecting all this stuff and they're using it to build ad profiles for use outside of the Google Apps for Education services. And then a lot of press just replaying Google's comments saying we aren't actually advertising within Google Apps for Education services. So they're kind of talking past each other, and the big corporate here is denying charges aren't actually specifically being levelled at them and getting a lot of airplay from that.
It's a fine line to tread because obviously to get the benefits of the Google services, and as you were saying earlier, being able to move from device to device and having multiple logons, or just when you log on, your data that you were using in the previous lesson syncs down. You need to have stuff being shared on the cloud. But it's where that information gets used and whether or not advertisers are able to get the information, and, blocking adverts coming to the students at school is important, and also working out what it is the students are looking at so advertisers can monetize that, or at least advertise to the children later in their life or when they're not at school, is a problem. And I suppose it's difficult to know quite where that line's been drawn. Perhaps the EFF say that line should be very tightly constrained, whereas it looks like the school districts and Google are saying, no, we should have that line slightly more lenient because it improves the way that they deliver content to the children for lessons and things. But it is a worrying trend that the data which is being produced by children in school is sitting on cloud services, and that can all be accessed by Google and to promote themselves later in the children's lives.
Well, call me cynical, but I don't see why anyone would expect Google to not save this data, even if they say they're not going to. It just feels like that is what they do. That is their whole reason for being, is for collecting all the data that they possibly can. And even if they're not going to use it directly now, it's all being squirreled away somewhere for possible use later.
So you're saying it's equivalent to what the NSA are doing, for instance?
Very much so, yeah.
Well, I suspect this is a story we're going to be coming back to in the future, at which stage we may well dig a little bit deeper and explore the murky financial relationship between Google and the EFF. But for now, let's move on to Over a Pint.
I don't think it came as a huge surprise to anyone when Mozilla announced this week that they were going to stop developing and selling Firefox OS phones. We reviewed one quite some time ago now, and less than stellar, I think you might say, was our review of it. And they also are looking to offload Thunderbird onto someone else, so they don't have to pay to develop that anymore. Mozilla has been a very important player in the open source world, and Firefox as a browser used to be amazing. When it was either that or IE, back in my Windows days, there was absolutely no competition at all. But then Chrome came along and Firefox has tried to keep up with it, and it's just lost market share. And so Mozilla seemed to be treading water. Is that even a polite way of putting it? Are they even moribund? I don't know. So I suppose the first question is, what do we think about them giving up on Firefox OS? Is it long overdue, or should they have stuck with it?
Well, you introed it saying that no one was surprised, and maybe I'm an odd one out, but I was surprised, and I thought the whole point of Mozilla having their own phone operating system was to have an open and web-based operating system on phones. And okay, let's ignore the sort of where they were going with it, i.e., should it have been low end, should it have been marketed at developing countries or not? Let's just put that to one side. Having a rival to the big two, and if Microsoft get their way, the big three, is a good thing. And having a company which, despite the fact that we're having this discussion about them, I think generally people in the open source world are behind what Mozilla are trying to do, even if they've not done it in the most successful way. And so I was surprised that they decided to stop developing their mobile operating system, because they put a lot of effort into it. It's a bit like when you have the magic 10 for a podcast. It means that you're much more likely to carry on and get to 20, 30, 50. But the fact they put so much time and effort into it, I therefore thought they would have continued it regardless of what the results were. They've put time and effort in there. They've got to a point where version 2.0, was it, that we reviewed, was usable, and okay, it had hiccups, but none of the phones we reviewed are as slick as Android, and there's obvious reasons why. So I was genuinely surprised and a bit perplexed as to why it went this way. But when you then put it into context with the movement of Thunderbird, which has not been really developed much at all in the last couple of years, there was a news article saying that they were stopping development and just going to do security fixes and things. You sort of wonder whether they've had a step back and a look at their portfolio to say, okay, where are we focusing? What are we trying to do? And, the Mozilla mission, just so we reiterate it and we start from the same point, is to promote openness, innovation, and opportunity on the web, which to them and to a lot of people, the web is coming more mobile-centric, and that's why they had to have some sort of market share of that realm to be relevant. And I wonder whether or not they have changed their mind in that, or whether it's just been so unsuccessful that they're just trying to sort of cut their losses before they plug and pour more money into a drain, and it still remains unsuccessful.
It's also unclear to me what's happening with Firefox OS, because I've seen reports that they're going to continue it for things like televisions at least.
Yeah, because that's a really well-known way of getting OSs out there. I mean,
absolutely.
No television has an OS that you can flash onto it. I've got a smart TV from Samsung, and admittedly it's like a sort of version 1, and it's painful, hence why I've got a Roku. But if I wanted to put Firefox OS on there, if they brought out a TV version, or the much-fabled, never-seen Ubuntu TV, I have no idea how I'd go about it. And I don't think it would even be applicable. You'd have to get a third device to have it running on it. So I think TV OSs is a sort of a non-starter.
Well, I think that it's not a case of flashing the OS on it. It's a case of going into a shop and buying a TV with it pre-installed.
Oh, yeah, that hadn't really occurred to me.
No, that was kind of where I was coming from, because I've read that Panasonic is still going to keep pushing ahead with Firefox OS TVs, but yeah, whether they're doing the development or whether Mozilla are themselves is pretty unclear, to be honest.
I mean, is there any hope of Firefox OS living on phones from community developers, as in people who aren't getting paid to do it?
I mean, no doubt it will hang around somewhere, and the source code is available, and a lot of people have put time and effort into developing it, or developing apps that they want to run on it, or web apps to run on it. But I can't see it really maintaining much longevity. The fact that hardware was coming out with it pre-installed, made for it, you would think that's going to be the best sort of kickstart they could have, to have the hardware and software running in collaboration. But to have just the software, you have to go out of your way to put it on, it's just going to become a a sideshow even more than it is. It's going to be, you can, and some people do, but no one will want to actually have it or run it, I don't think.
No, and we have run it down, I think, justifiably on the show. But you've got to remember that there were quite a lot of devices out there running Firefox OS, certainly a lot more than there are running Ubuntu Touch, and people still have high hopes for that.
I mean, I do sort of wonder what use that bit of hardware in your drawer is now, Joe.
Is it in my drawer? I thought Paddy had it.
Yeah, I've still got it in my possession, and the answer, I think, is CyanogenMod.
Yeah. Yeah, well, even at the time we reviewed it, I put that on to compare, and that seemed to be quite a reasonable experience. I mean, it wasn't high-end, obviously, but it was usable. So, yeah, I think that is pretty much the future for all of the Firefox OS phones. I did quite fancy that clear one that came out in Japan. I can't remember what it was called now. It was see-through, and you could see all the innards of it. I thought that was quite cool looking, but I don't suppose they sold very many of them.
Yeah, it went on sale on Amazon US, and it was like $50 or something. It was down by sort of more than a third or a quarter from its original retail price. And you're right, it was a sexy-looking phone. It was just very different, I think, and you're seeing the insides and things. But the other bit of software that we're discussing here is Thunderbird. And so do either of you use that at all?
Well, I do have it installed because you can't get rid of it in Ubuntu without getting rid of all your desktop. But I have used it a little bit for doing encrypted email. And it's a tool that I use occasionally when I need to rather than all the time. Because I just don't really have the need for email clients that store the mail locally. But it's something that I set up for my dad. And so now I'm starting to wonder what I'm going to do, whether I'm going to move him away from that or try and teach him to use webmail. I don't know, really.
Yeah, it's something that was part of my life for many years, but hasn't been for a good few years now, because I've moved over to Gmail and found that a far more convenient way of aggregating mail from a whole variety of accounts and having it accessible across a multiple number of devices as well. But, I mean, a lot of the conversations I've heard on other shows and also read in the press, people throwing up their hands saying the equivalent of the fact that Thunderbird is the only free and open source mail client out there of any consequence, and that's simply not true.
Yeah, you told me about Clause Mail, which I've been using and is lighter weight and has fewer features, but the features that it's lacking are features that I don't need. So that seems to be a very good alternative to Thunderbird.
Clause with a K, is that a KDE app?
No, it's Clause
No.
CLAWS.
Oh, they spelled something normally for once, okay.
Yeah, I think it's got most of the functionality most people want. I mean, it's even got PGP support. And there's also, is it Fossa Mail?
Never heard of that one.
Yeah, it's written by the same guys. Well, I say written. It's a fork of Thunderbird that's produced by the same guys that maintain the Palemin browser, which we'll be speaking about in a future show. So that seems like a fair bet as well if you're worried about where Thunderbird's going.
Oh, yeah, that does ring a bell. Yeah, it's kind of as Pale Moon is to Firefox, Fossa Mail is to Thunderbird. So, yeah, that seems like the hope for the future there.
Of course, it's not just the software products Mozilla produce that have been causing a little bit of consternation in our world over the recent months. I mean, there was the whole brouhaha over the advertising tiles, which they've now decided to backtrack on and not have in place. And the integration of Pocket within Firefox itself. I mean, there's a lot of decisions that have put a lot of people's backs up.
Yeah, the justification of removal of advertising tiles was to improve the experience for the user, so they would have more content that was based on things they'd looked at or web pages they'd been to, rather than just having adverts on the tiled screen that you get when you have a new tab. And I was sort of optimistic that was them saying, well, let's not look at how we're going to make revenue, which is obviously the advertising model, but let's look at making our browser more user-friendly, and then by getting our browser to be more popular through that and streamlining and improvements generally, that they would then be in a position to have a browser which can compete with Chrome and regain its market share. And by doing that, you would be able to get the advertisers through clicks rather than tiles. And I wonder if this is sort of the crux of this conversation, where they've stepped back and looked at what they're trying to do and have, streamlined some bits and reduced other areas in order to focus on the key areas, which, let's be honest, is Firefox.
I think it is from a product point of view. Whether we ought to be concentrating on product or not is something I'll get to in a little while. But yeah, I mean, we had a story in the news. I think you actually brought it to us, Jesse, about the market share of Firefox, and it was sort of hovering around 10% or so.
Yeah, that was on the last news show. So I've just fired up net market share to see what they say today, and Firefox 42 is at 6.4%. So if that's where that original number came from, they're clearly going down yet further.
I do see it as a good thing that they're scaling back, because they felt like they were just developing too many different things. And to get rid of the mobile phone OS and Thunderbird means that all they'll have left is Firefox. And therefore, you would hope that they'll be able to develop it, make it better, and properly compete with Chrome again, rather than this situation where they were once king and now hardly anyone uses them. It seems to only be people who care about software freedom, really, who are using it, or people like me who are just too stubborn to move over, even though I've pretty much had enough of Firefox and its slowness.
Well, let me draw an analogy with the desktop then, because it's largely people who care about software freedom and tinkering full stop, to be honest, that use Linux on the desktop. And for years, Linux has hovered around 2% market share. So if you're suggesting that Mozilla's actions are going to be as successful for them with Mozilla as Linux has been on the desktop, because it's the same group of people wanting to use it, that doesn't really bode very well at all.
The market share will be bigger naturally because a lot of people won't take the steps to move from Windows to Linux for whatever reason, whatever software, or they don't know how to install it or things like that. But they may well want to step away from Microsoft bit by bit. So I think aiming for 2% is, I see what you're saying, it's going to reduce down to 2% roughly, but I think it'll be more than that. But I see your point that it's not a large base on which to model your business plan.
I think that it has to offer something that Chrome doesn't. And the buzzword that seems to be going around, at least tech types at the moment, is privacy. And could they offer privacy that Chrome can't? Well, the fact that it's open source and doesn't report home to Google should be something that I think they're trying to sell, rather than trying to add other proprietary stuff like Pocket, which is actually quite useful and is something that I used all the time when you were away, Paddy. But I think they need to be concentrating on making a fairly slick, fast browser that emphasizes privacy and perhaps prompts you to install things like NoScript or AdBlock, or not necessarily prompts you to, but facilitates that, and then try and play that up and try and push. Not necessarily saying Chrome is not private and it doesn't respect your privacy, but play up the positive that we do respect your privacy. And unless they do something like that, and that's just off the top of my head, I'm sure there are other potential benefits of Firefox over Chrome. Unless they can actually get that into people's heads and really push that, they're just going to die because people will move to Chrome because it's just easier and better.
I'd half agree with you. I mean, I'd go a lot further, to be honest. But let me just ask you both a question, and that is, what do you think the value is in Mozilla? Why do we care about it enough to be talking about the organisation? I mean, where is the value in Mozilla of the brand?
Well, it has a historical value, doesn't it? But back in the days when it was the only real alternative to Internet Explorer, and it was the only real decent browser on Linux, and the alternative to Safari on a Mac. And it's got this historical significance that seems to be dwindling, and maybe maybe we shouldn't be talking about it. Maybe it is irrelevant. Maybe we should just say goodbye, Mozilla, and let it die.
But it does do more than just have Firefox. So there was a Greater London lug a couple of years ago, which was a daytime thing, and they had a number of presentations from sort of open software and open hardware enthusiasts. It was a bit like a very mini OggCamp, just over sort of 5 hours. And that was held at some offices or facilities that were run by Mozilla, and it was very, very kind of modern tech, if you will. I mean, I work in a fairly smart modern office, but this had that whole sort of, the drinks were free and you didn't have to pay for the chocolate bars and all this kind of, and there were bean bags and sofas everywhere. It was all kind of very airy-fairy, but it had that kind of relevance because they were supporting us for free, having this little group of people of maybe 20, 25 to get together and talk about open hardware and discuss open software. And we didn't have to talk about Mozilla. There wasn't a representative there sort of peddling Mozilla and Firefox. It was just that like-minded people who had the same views as the missions of Mozilla were allowed a space for free to discuss it. And had that not been there, we'd have been paying, some office somewhere or gone to a pub or something. We don't have the right facilities. So there is more to it than just Firefox. However, the sort of front-facing view that people get is Firefox. And I have to admit, my example is an incredible niche in what Mozilla is doing. I don't really know what that office is used for during the weekday, but I assume they develop blue sky thinking ideas and talk about the future of open web and farty things like that.
Running things up the flagpole, etc.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Now, that's interesting. I mean, all the way through this conversation, we've largely talked about product there. We keep talking about Thunderbird and Firefox and what have you, as if this is a company that's making and flogging product. When obviously in reality at the moment they're a company that's taking money from Yahoo. They used to take money from Google and they make their money by click-throughs. But I would suggest to both of you that the real value that Mozilla has as a brand is in the intangible. I mean, we all think of them as worth talking about still because emotionally we're attached to them. They're seen as an honest brand. They're seen as a trustworthy brand. And surely, if management at Mozilla wasn't so stuffed with MBA types who keep churning out this absolute gibberish if you read the blog.
You refer to words like learnings.
Yeah, and that kind of reflects back on what you were saying about this space you were talking about a minute ago. I hadn't planned for this whatsoever, but there you go. It's just how things work out sometimes. It's MBA gibberish, and it's people trying to make a quick buck and then move on to the next job. And no one seems to understand the value in Mozilla is in trust. We still trust it as a brand. And Mozilla could take that trust and actually do something useful with it, but they don't seem to grasp that that is within their capabilities.
Well, you say that their value is in people trusting them and being a trusted brand, but I think that they have somewhat betrayed that trust with things like Pocket integration and the advert tiles. And so I think that they've damaged that. There is still a certain level of trust remaining and a certain level of goodwill. But I still think that it is a historical value that isn't necessarily still valuable today in 2015, nearly 2016.
Oh, you're undoubtedly right about the damage that's been done. But as I suggested, I think the fact that we're all sat here talking about it shows there is still residual trust there and hope for a better future for them. I mean, if you think about what we're talking about in the news with Let's Encrypt, why isn't that the sort of initiative that Mozilla is doing out of the box? I know they're involved in it, but if they want to truly create a better, freer, open internet, why did they not come up with the idea of a free certificate authority? I mean, everybody could see for years. I mean, I've been banging on about it on this show for the last couple of years, about how broken certificate authority regime is. So why, they obviously saw this, why did they not choose to do anything about it? Why are they choosing to dump Thunderbird at this stage, where people are worried about privacy, as has been suggested already? Why are they not trying to do what nobody has succeeded at yet, and actually properly integrate PGP and encryption end to end in an email client and sell them privacy, as you suggested. I mean, I don't understand why they're not leveraging trust, which is their big asset, as far as I can see, in order to help all of us and make a better internet out there, which is their mission statement.
Well, the certificate authority thing requires more than one organisation, I think. It needed a number of groups to get together and form something that was authoritative. You can't just have one person or one entity like Mozilla creating this certificate authority that we needed.
Why?
Again, it goes back to trust, because although they are trusted and have been historically, I think you need other organizations that you can trust so that all your eggs aren't in one basket. I suppose maybe that said, maybe I'm wrong and maybe they could have done it themselves, but I can see why they got together with others to do it.
I think they got together with others to do it because they haven't got any strategic vision on their part. They keep doing all these things, throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks, without any idea of realizing their own mission statement. And if they did have less of these MBA types in senior positions there who were just looking at next quarter's earnings, then maybe the future would look somewhat brighter for them.
Yeah, I keep on thinking that if they were able to just step back from the numbers and the figures and decide what they want to do and why they're doing it and how they're going to do those things. Maybe that's not quite the right way of putting it. They need to step back from the numbers and just decide, this is what we envision as a good thing, and this is what we stand for, and this is how it's going to be. And the people will follow, assuming that is done in a way that people believe in what they're saying and what they're doing. So rather than, like you say, they believe that the populace is moving over to phone OSs, therefore they need to make their own phone OS. If they said, well, we really need to have a browser on all devices and the browser should be XYZ, they should make a browser that's XYZ on all devices, and the people will follow if their policy is right. Do you know what I mean? They should define what is right, not chase what is right. That's the sort of difference I see.
Yeah, and I think they need to understand about power and influence, and having the most money in the world doesn't give you the most influence in the world. I mean, you think about the fact that the President of the United States is the most important person, the most powerful person in America. The second most powerful person in America isn't one of his cabinet members, it's his wife, because his wife over time has the opportunity to change his long-term thinking, to guide him, and if there's a specific issue, to say, no, you shouldn't be doing it this way. Fine, he makes the final decision, but there's a vast amount of influence there from an unelected person who nominally has no power whatsoever. And if Mozilla would stop saying, okay, we need to take $300, $400, $500 million every year from an advertising company in order to feel worthwhile, and realize that by doing the right thing, they would actually gain far more power and influence to determine the future direction of the internet and to nominally actually fulfill their own mission statement, then things would look quite different, I think, going forwards.
Well, I don't know about you, Jesse, but I vote Paddy becomes the new boss of Mozilla and sorts it out. That was all very sensible.
Yeah, just after he gets an MBA.
Yeah. But with that, we come to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again next week for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Drive safe. Bye all.
See you later.